virtually today. My name is Harald Ginsky, work for the German Environment Agency, which is a consultative board for our Environment Ministry in Germany. I also would like to thank my partners in organizing this International Soil and Governance Conference, which is of very high importance. To name our partners again, the University of Natural Resources and Life Science in Vienna, David Ennekel and Nikolaus Handling, my colleague Oliver Ruppel from the University of Graz, and our partners, the United Nations Environmental Program and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Furthermore, of course, I would like to welcome all participants to this conference, and I would look forward to our 4 panels today and hope for very intensive discussions on this very important topic. As I have said, we have today 4 panels. In the afternoon, we have 3 panels which will dig a bit deeper in the issue of soil governance and soil law. And today in the morning, in our first panel, we would like to address these 2 issues, the need for sustainable soil management and for an effective soil governance, more from a political perspective. And we have invited to this panel 5 very experts with outstanding expertise from their perspective, to name the colleagues. Professor Dr. Messner, President of the German Environment Agency. Second, Professor Kameri-Mbote, Head of the Legal Division of United Nations Environmental Program. Dr. Su with the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Dr. Andrea Vittori with the EU Commission, responsible also for land use and manage in the land use and management unit. And last but not least, Mr. Li Feng, Director, Land and Water Division with FAO. Oliver Ruppel and I will jointly moderate this session this morning. And we have invited and asked the panelists to give at the beginning short inputs of, let's say, about 10 minutes from their perspectives. And this will be followed by a moderated panel discussion. And with that, I move over to Oliver Ruppel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harald. We have the great pleasure to welcome Professor Patricia Kameri-Mbote from Kenya, Nairobi, and Professor Dr. Dirk Messner, who is with us, as I've just heard, from Romania, from Bucharest. We will start with Professor Kameri-Mbote, who is under a little bit of time constraint. Welcome, Patricia. Welcome, Professor Kameri-Mbote. Karibu, Kenya. I would like to briefly introduce her. She's the Director of the Law Division of the United Nations Environment Program. Previously, she was a founding research director of the International Environmental Law Research Center and was program director for Africa for over 20 years. She's a member of the Senior Council Bar in Kenya and has been a professor of law at the Law School of the University of Nairobi. And she has many other hats, which I cannot introduce to you today. But Patricia, it is a great honor and pleasure to welcome you to our conference. And I would like to give you the splendid opportunity to address us here today. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Oliver, and thanks, colleagues. It's really a pleasure for me to be here with us, talking about the importance of soils. I think in one of the things that I have noticed, having been a professor also of property law, is the neglect of soil. Even though the native word for land is soil, people talk about land, but don't really talk about soil. And this therefore gets me to the point that a focused attention on soil is very critical. I think in previous work that Pamela, Oliver, Harold, myself, and other colleagues did, it was noted that soil is the melting pot of many things. And I think we haven't given soil that space. From the point of view of UNEP, soil is critical for addressing what we now face as an existential crisis of pollution, nature and biodiversity loss, and climate change. Soil is actually a habitat in its own right. It is also a resource in its own right, and it is a very big sink for carbon, and therefore a very critical element in dealing with climate change. When we're dealing with pollution as well, we talk a lot about water pollution, we talk about air pollution, but I think soil pollution also has a lot of impact, and it impacts also on a very direct issue of food, because if soil is polluted and you're growing food on the polluted soil, there could actually be possibilities of transference of pollutants. But over and above that, if soil is polluted, it may not produce what we need as food. And with the food security being a problem, this is an issue. As I said, many spaces neglect and gloss over the issue of soil. And if you look at I think the only focused discussions we have on soil have been within the context of the United Nations Convention to combat desertification and the focus on land degradation neutrality. And of course, the associated SDG, I believe it's SDG 14, if I'm not wrong. So looking at soil governance gives us an opportunity to bring different players together through governance tools. And we are talking about a raft of tools here. We are talking about policies. We are talking about institutions. We are talking about guidelines. We are talking about standards. But we are also talking about legal frameworks at the international, regional, national, and subnational levels. Because at the end of the day, whatever we have needs to reach the lowest space. And I think we also have a duty to mainstream soil in existing instruments. For instance, the multilateral environmental agreements, such as the ones on climate change, on biodiversity, even on chemicals, the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions. Many times we are talking about issues that affect soil, but in a very disjointed way. So as we look at governance of soil, we need to look at how we can mainstream this in these instruments, because at the end of the day, because states are parties, they're going to be implementing these multilateral environmental agreements. And we could actually, at that point, then look at how do we bring in soil. Within the law division of UNEP, we have invested heavily in having coherence and synergies between different multilateral environmental agreements. And I think we could use soil as a space for working on that kind of coherence, so that as you're looking at chemicals, that is Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm, or you're looking at the biodiversity conventions, because it's not only the Convention on Biological Diversity, there is also the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species or Flora and Fauna, which may not look like it is directly related to soil, but when you look at the degradation of lands that are either protected areas or where wildlife is, then you can see that soil can also be there. I'd like to point at a current opportunity that we can actually seize just now. The United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity is now working on the global biodiversity framework, moving from the Aichi targets to the global goals for biodiversity. And if you look at the current 21, I think they're going to add the 22nd target. You see opportunities to bring in soil. If you look at the first one, it's on spatial planning. If you look at the second one, you will see references there to ecosystems, like when they talk about having 30% of the world protected by 2030, what are we talking about and where does soil come in? Also, if you look at the goals themselves, goals A and B talk about integrity. They talk about health. They talk about functions and services. And these are issues that are really relevant for soil. Within UNEP, again, looking at not just at the global level, we have talked about the need to look at regional levels. The African Ministerial Conference on the Environment recently passed a resolution to work on soil governance within the African continent. That again gives us a good opportunity, and we can look to see how in other parts of the world that are dealing with the same problem, we could actually also bring in soil. I believe my colleague Robert Wabunoha may join you later because he was directly involved in that resolution. I'd like to stop there and thank you for giving me the opportunity to intervene.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Thank you, Professor Kameri-Mbote, for taking time to join us from Nairobi, Kenya, and to share some of the insights that you have gained in your work at UNEP as Director of the Law Division, dealing also with the element of soil. Increasingly, we have been working on this jointly for several years, and soil is gaining momentum. And I thank you for making this point to us here today and to the audience, which brings me to this next speaker, that is Professor Dr. Dirk Messner. Good morning, Professor Messner. Good morning, Professor Messner, to Bucharest in Romania. I will briefly introduce him. He's the president of the German Environment Agency since 2000, previously served as director of the Institute for Environment and Human Security at the United Nations University in Bonn in Germany, and vice rector of the same university. Prior to becoming director of this university, Professor Messner had been director of the German Development Institute. He is an internationally renowned expert on globalization, global governance, transformation pathways to sustainability, decarbonization, and the list goes on and on. Professor Messner, thank you for joining us here today. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Ruppel, dear colleagues and friends. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you. I would like to look at the soil issue from three perspectives briefly to have an input for our discussion here. The first point which I wanted to make, my starting point, is the international system and multiple crises. I mean, we are talking about international soil governance. Therefore, we need to understand also the broader international context in which we have to reflect upon international soil governance then. And I would like to emphasize three issues briefly. The first issue builds directly on what Patricia obviously already mentioned and said. The first part of the multiple crisis perspective is Earth system crisis, tipping points in the Earth system coming nearer to us, biodiversity crisis, climate crisis. Under high time pressure, we need to organize the transformation towards sustainability. The soil issue is part of that. So this is the first dimension of my multiple crisis perspective. The second dimension is that we are still coming out of the pandemic. And this implies that our political systems, social systems, economic systems are still very much concentrated on recovering in the context of the pandemic. And this is the second element of the multiple crisis. And the third element of the multiple crisis is then the Russian war against Ukraine. And the Russian war against Ukraine obviously imply humanitarian crisis, security threats. And this translates into international cooperation challenges. And we need international cooperation for soil governance and other sustainability issues. So we cannot isolate our sustainability-related transformation debates from this international volatilities and cooperation crises. We need more cooperation in a situation in which we are in a crisis of international cooperation. And as you all know, the aggression of Russia against Ukraine also is related directly to food crisis and energy crisis. And both elements, food and energy, are then again related to soil. So soil and the soil debate, which we are having today, international soil governance and international soil cooperation, is part of this broader picture. This is my point number one. My perspective number two is then on soil, and while it is now so highly on the political agenda, and I agree with what Patricia said, for a longer period of time, soil and land has not been at the center of our sustainability debates. Climate was at the center of our sustainability debates, but step by step we are learning that soil is one of the masterpieces of what we need to focus on when we think about transformations towards sustainability and stabilizing the Earth system. Soil is a multi-purpose resource, or better to say would be, it is a multi-purpose system we are talking about. And Patricia mentioned that, the minister already talked about this. I mean, if you look at soil, it is about food and the food system and food security, and therefore about human security and the welfare of human beings. So soil, food, and food security is the first dimension. There's a second important dimension, which has been already emphasized. Soil is also very relevant as a sink, and therefore it is directly relevant and directly related to climate protection. So the sink function. Then we have the biodiversity dimension. And Patricia also emphasized this, and I'm re-emphasizing this. So beyond food system and the sink function, it is about biodiversity. Biodiversity because the soil and land systems are related to forests. They are related to peatlands. And this is all about the stability of the biodiversity systems themselves. So the biodiversity dimension. And last but not least, land and soil is also relevant for energy production, biomass-based energy production. And in a broader sense, soil is also a relevant dimension of our discussion, which we are having on bioeconomy. So you can see that there are multiple purposes and multiple uses of soil, and we need to understand better and manage, obviously, much better the trade-offs between those different purposes and uses of soil and land, and the governance of these trade-offs. And we need to look for synergies and co-benefits. And I think this is the direction in which our discussion should go. I mean, if you have then these different uses in front of yourself, which I just mentioned, food, sinks, biodiversity, bioeconomy, and bioenergy, it becomes clear immediately that the way we use soil is relevant for our economies, for multiple sectors in our economies. It is relevant for human well-being and human prosperous pathways. And it is at the same time a key element of our overall discussion on stabilizing the Earth system and the ecosystems. And when I'm looking at the governance dimension, we have, as I already said, we have to understand and manage better. Andrea, we are having these kind of discussions in the European context day by day. No? So managing these conflicts and mobilizing the co-benefits is about intersectorial perspectives. We very often are not good in intersectorial perspectives. We are organized in silos. No? So how we can become better in this regard is element number one. Then element number two, Patricia mentioned it. We need to stop degradation of soil. systems, because this is what we are observing. No? We are not in a stable situation. We are in a situation of shrinking soil resources and degradation of resources when it comes to soil around the globe. And we have to find solutions under high time pressure. So this is my perspective on why soil is becoming so important and why we are having activities around the globe, in Germany, in the European Union, the African Union, African countries and African partners, at the level of the United Nations and so forth. This is one of the centerpieces of our sustainability discourse, which we need to focus on. And my last point, and finishing already, Mr. Ruppel, my last point is very briefly on Germany. My colleague Harald Ginsky will move into this issue more closely and dig deeper on that on the next panel. But I would like to emphasize two elements here to make clear where we are having our priorities when it comes to soil and stability challenges in the German context. And the first element is that we are working hard to bring the climate mitigation part looking on soil, and the climate adaptation part looking on soil, and the biodiversity part looking on soil together. As I said, avoiding the trade-offs and managing the co-benefits is what we're having in mind. And specific areas here are soil sealing, protection of peatlands, and sustainable agriculture. And we are trying and working hard to make progress in these dimensions. So the synergies, the trade-offs, management of the trade-offs, the co-benefits, and mobilizing those is what we are currently focused on hard. The second element which I wanted to emphasize is more about the way we look at governance. And here our emphasis is on prevention, ex ante policy, so avoiding crises, avoiding overuse of resources, and not only organizing ex post measures to get crises under control. So preventive policies. And when you talk about preventive policies, data is coming into play. Data is becoming important. Monitoring systems are becoming important. Digitalization can help us here to understand better the dynamics of soil resources. So this is what I wanted to emphasize in my last part in the around the German debate. Synergies between mitigation, adaptation, biodiversity, and moving from ex post to ex ante soil policies. This is what we are currently working on in the German context. Thank you very much for your attention.
Very much, Professor Messner, for pointing out connecting the dots of sustainable soil management, especially in times of multiple crises, of global crisis. Prevention is definitely better than cure, and most importantly, soil has become a medium that is increasingly being recognized, and I commend also the work of the German Environment Agency, both at the European level and internationally. I hand over to my colleague Harald Ginsky now.
Many thanks, Oliver, and thank you to the first presenters for the interesting talks. We will now have three additional presenters. First, Ms. Su from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. She is a researcher on conflict, peace, and in the context of geopolitics and sustainable development. She focuses on the perspectives of climate security, on food and agricultural systems, and I move on to Ms. Su. Ms. Su.
Thank you so much for the organizers of this conference. As mentioned, I'm representing the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And as I am not a soil scientist or specialist, but rather a social and political scientist by training, I will keep my comments to a more general level. But soil, as has been discussed already, is an essential basis, not only of almost all global agriculture, but also for sustaining quality life, both human and non-human, and so many other ways beyond immediate provision. It is precious, largely non-renewable, and yet tremendously neglected in most corridors of power and in most parts of the world. Much of the discussion today, I imagine, is going to focus on sustainable soil management in times of perhaps quote unquote normal governance. That is jockeying to get soil onto a rather crowded policy agenda, coordinating different layers of stakeholders in different sectors, managing competing use values and demands on the earth around us. And that, of course, entails making a more forceful case of what we already understand are necessary SSM practices to address the shared problems of climate mitigation and adaptation, agricultural productivity and food security, alleviating poverty, and so many of the SDG targets which states around the world have signed up for. But in these minutes, I just wanted to focus on the challenges of sustainable soil and indeed environmental management when normal governance breaks down, when in times of military or armed conflict, we're not just dealing with coordinated frictions or working, progressively towards improvements on legal or institutional or regulatory frameworks for soil governance, but really situations of active and deliberate destruction, not only of opposing military forces, but very often the very environmental landscape itself, to include soils. And all of the direct and indirect impacts on soils' physical, chemical, and biological properties that warfare does bring. Today, over a century past World War I, we still have soil contaminants from that conflict spread throughout Europe. And today, this very day, we are witnessing what has been large-scale ground warfare yet again in Europe, and territorial conflict, with more than a third of Ukraine having been subject to direct military aggression. And that land constitutes both some of Europe's most ecologically diverse and sensitive, and as we all know, with some of the most fertile soils in the world, as well as the most industrialized, toxic and polluting sites that have not been spared or protected in the military aggressions. And moreover, we now understand, however, so much more about the general linkages between armed conflict and environmental degradation, with environmental degradation not only precipitating social tensions and sometimes leading outright to violence in cases, but violence and conflict also then feeding into a vicious cycle of poor or absent environmental governance, in which soil is often a forgotten casualty. And globally, conflicts are on the rise. While this used to be largely confined to intrastate conflicts, we now see the rise of internationalized and even international conflicts. Ukraine, again, not the least, but a truly devastating example of that. And I think here I just want to make a point that it is all very well for, the scientific community and for environmentalists and even politicians to say something like, the nation that destroys its soil destroys itself, which Roosevelt stated almost a century ago. But when the destruction of a nation becomes a political objective, what then are the prospects for soil governance and management? And this is to say that we can discuss things like soil security and even national soil security, but what does that amount to in comparison with perspectives that consider both territory and security to be part of a zero-sum game of competition rather than a cooperative and common endeavor? So fortunately, there have been in the past few years something of a watershed of positive developments in terms of acknowledging, preventing, and managing the negative fallout on the environment of the devastation of conflict. There's few direct references, but certainly there is relevance for soil management. There's greater recognition and attention by civil society and international organizations and even states to the effects that conflict has on the environment, but also important developments in terms of the legal frameworks for protecting the environment in relation to armed conflict, with the new legal framework going forward in the UN General Assembly, which importantly also has applicability before, during, and after armed conflicts, so still also with an eye towards prevention and also in situations of occupation. Updated provisions by the ICRC of international humanitarian law on protecting the environment in armed conflict, with more direct references to soil as part of that natural environment, resolutions in the United Nations Environmental Assembly, and even a growing number of UN Security Council statements on the linkages between natural resources, climate change, environmental degradation, and conflict and insecurity. I think the main crux, though, is implementation of what are still very much largely non-binding agreements, ensuring uptake and that stakeholders and actors are taken into account and held accountable. And I think my main point here is that that requires understanding environmental management and indeed sustainable soil management, not only as a technical endeavor or as a matter of simple problem solving in which all stakeholders more or less have the same ultimate aim and simply need to be coordinated, but really seeing it for what it is. It's a political task. And indeed, sometimes governance itself is at the heart of conflict. When you look at Ukraine today, you have parts of the country progressively aligning and integrating their legislation and environmental frameworks to EU law, regulations, and standards. Meanwhile, you have breakaway and annexed portions of the countries whose de facto authorities are aligning their frameworks to the Russian Federations. These questions take on much higher stakes when environmental legislation and regulation is itself actively politicized. So there's no obviously no easy answers to any of these difficult problems. On that point, I maybe just want to conclude on a point that while we know that healthy soils are a critical dimension of a healthy ecosystem, it is also worth stressing that a healthy political and social ecosystem is necessary for healthy soils. And certainly that's important during normal times when, functioning institutions of good governance, scientific openness, robust civil society, these are important today, under normal conditions, but perhaps are particularly important in times of conflict where things like baseline stock taking and monitoring of environmental violations and ensuring accountability are just as important, if not more so. And so in conclusion, I just want to reiterate that to make so-called soil security into a truly broad-based conversation, there's a lot to be done, not only on the soil side, but in fact on the security side of coming to understandings of common security and common insecurity. And that requires deeply political work. So I'll just conclude there.
Many thanks to Ms. Su for your input. I think the overview on the interface of environmental management and armed conflict was very informative. Also, the point which you have made that there are some positive developments on the political side and political forums concerning this interface and how we can manage it. Then you address the issue of how these instruments could be implemented. That this is a real challenge. And last but not least, you mentioned this important point that security is really an issue also for sustainable soil management at the beginning. So many thanks for that. And we have now the next speaker, which is Mr. Andrea Vittori. He is now the Deputy Head of the Land Use and Management Unit at the European Commission. Before that, he is part of a team that conducted the negotiations for the 7th EU Environmental Action Program, and he has also worked for the Commission on strategic planning and policy coordination, on resource efficiency, and on an environmental program for small and medium-sized enterprises. Before that, he has also worked for the European Parliament and for European civil society organization. Mr. Vittori, please process. Cannot hear you. Okay. So, Maybe we can switch to the next speaker.
Can you hear me correctly?
Now we
Yes, we can hear you now.
perfect.
Okay. It was yeah, it was something in the setting that didn't work. Sorry for that. So good morning, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to intervene in this very, very important international conference on this topic. I think that both the minister and the previous speakers have already painted the how crucial is soil in today's policy making, well beyond the pure environmental policy. So I will not go into that again. What I would like to present you is a little bit how we're dealing with sustainable soil management at EU level, and what our next steps will be. First of all, the soil has become a key pillar of the EU Green Deal because it has mentioned that it is essential for climate mitigation and climate adaptation. It's essential for biodiversity and for the priorities under the biodiversity strategy and the nature restoration law. The minister has mentioned it. Is essential for food production, and this is why it's also a key pillar of the farm to fork communication and strategy, and a key element in the common agricultural policy. But it's also a key element of the Zero Pollution Action Plan and the aim to achieve zero pollution in the EU, as we know that pollutants and contaminants accumulate on soil and therefore undermine the provision of key ecosystem services. In terms of policy, soil has been integrated in different pieces of legislation and policies, from the bioeconomy to the forest strategy, from the climate adaptation strategy to the chemical strategy, zero pollution, and so on. A number of provisions have been included, as well as a completely new research stream under the soil mission under Horizon Europe, focusing really making soil one of the key challenges that Europe needs to address. Why so? Because we know that the soil in the EU is still degrading. I think the European Environmental Agency, with the support of the various national agencies, has summarized in all recent reports. And this poses the risk not only for the resilience of the EU continent, but also to achieve the different targets and objectives that are set in the EU legislation. The new soil policy that the Commission introduced with the Green Deal and materialized in the soil strategy that was adopted by the Commission almost a year ago, focused on three key pillars. One is the soil as a healthy soil as a solution for the biodiversity crisis. Another one is healthy soil for the circular economy and to achieve zero pollution. And the third one is healthy soil as a solution to fight and adapt to climate change. And a number of actions under the soil strategy have focused really on how to ensure that these key ecosystem services that soil provide in Europe can be preserved and further enhanced. So the aim is to achieve healthy soils by 2050, with a number of concrete actions by 2030, and ensuring that sustainable soil management becomes the new normal in the EU. This means integrating soil sustainable management in the different sectors, in the industrial policy, in land use planning, in public policies at national, regional, and especially at local level, where most of the decisions on land use planning are taken, but also in agriculture, in the common agriculture policy, and in the farming practices that millions of farmers throughout the EU adopt on a daily basis. But also the strategy works on concrete tools, has provided the pathways for improving the knowledge about soil with a new monitoring approach and further research on soil, support of EU funding and a mix of public funding, but also stimulate public funding through, for instance, the Sustainable Finance Initiative and the taxonomy. But also, as we know, that is not only few policymakers or soil scientists that can really change things on the ground. There is a need to have a societal engagement. There's a need to promote a soil literacy. Still, for a lot of people, soil is the dirt under our feet. So we need to make sure that everybody is aware of the value of soil and the different ecosystem services that it provides. We are thus developed a new governance at European level. We just had at the beginning of October the first meeting of the soil expert group that for the first time now is also enlarged, not only is composed not only by member state authorities, competent authorities, but also to industry representative, farmers organizations, NGOs, soil expert, and so on and so forth. Basically, all the stakeholder community that is relevant for soil policy. Precisely for this societal engagement, we need really to work together. Another key element of soil is that, as I said, a lot of decisions are taken at local level. This is why the principle of subsidiarity is very, very relevant. And we are implementing it in all actions related to soil. So the role of the EU is to act as a promoter, as facilitator of action, providing the framework, providing the funding, providing the support to member states, to regional authorities, and to local authorities, as well as to individual initiatives through the LIFE funds, for instance, on soil protection. The next step, and is what we are working on, and it's keep us very, very busy, is the development of a legal framework for sustainable soil management at European level, and a proposal that the Commission committed to deliver in the second quarter of next year on soil health law. The aim of this piece of legislation will be to implement the commitment to achieve healthy soils by 2050 in the EU. It will, of course, provide common definitions at European level, for instance, on healthy soil, on what is land take, and so on. It will provide also a framework for a common monitoring and assessment of soil health, provision on the sustainable use of soil, because it's not only about protecting and not touching. We all know that we use soil on a daily basis for all our activities. It will tackle also the issue of contaminated sites. We still have too many contaminated sites in the EU, and we need to promote a circular economy for brownfield decontamination and recycling to avoid to take further land take from natural areas or agricultural land. And then, of course, there will be a governance mechanism to work with member state and regional local authorities and for the implementation of these provisions and reporting. The public consultation is ongoing and it will close this week. We are still counting to a large number of replies of citizens and stakeholders. And the impact assessment is ongoing. So we are confident that we will be able to put forward, with the inputs of all the different stakeholders and member state authorities, quite an important piece of legislation in spring next year. I stop here for the moment, and thank you very much for your attention.
Many thanks, Mr. Vittori, for your input and for providing this overview on the EU work on sustainable soil management. My congratulations with regard to your ambitious plan with regard to soil policy, first, and second, also for this ambitious plan concerning an EU health soil law, which is really a major challenge to develop a reasonable concept. And I would like to emphasize 2 points, but because you have said that you try to streamline EU law by integrating soil in all policy developments. This was also the challenge which was mentioned for international law by Patricia. So maybe the EU concept could be kind of a role model also for the international level. We need to figure that out. This is my first point. And second point, which would I like to emphasize, is you emphasize that you have the concept of this broad and inclusive participation within, by enlarging the soil expert group. Maybe this is also a point which we need to investigate further, because this is a methodological and procedure-wise aspect which needs to be taken and analyzed further. So many thanks for this input. And now I would like to come to our last but not least, the least speaker, Mr. Li Feng. He is director of the Law and Water Division at Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Dr. Li leads for our works on soils, land, water, geospatial, climate financing through the partnership with the Adaptation Fund, co-leads UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, and he acts as the focal point UNCCD Convention and the Ramsar Convention. He has got 15 years of experience on water policy, river basin and freshwater ecosystem management through his works with WWF China, WWF International, and Wetlands International in Netherlands. Mr. Li Feng, thanks for coming.
Thank you very much for your introduction and also for your kind invitation to me. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to be here today for the International Soil Law and Governance Conference and to have the opportunity to address such an important topic that is right now putting the human survival at risk. The number of people facing the food insecurity and undernourishment continue to grow at an alarming rate. FAO estimated that between 720 million and 811 million people in the world facing hunger in the year 2020, and significantly increased of 24% from the previous year in 2019. Nearly 2.37 billion people didn't have access to adequate food in 2020, almost twice the population of India. And these figures increased by a further 40 million people in last year. So no region of the world has been spared. The high cost of healthy diets, and also the high level of the poverty and the income inequality continue to keep the healthy diets after the reach for around 3 billion people in every region of the world. Conflicts, climate change, extreme events, economic downturns, and pandemics are also putting great pressure on soil in countries that have been seeing the agri-food imports limited. The urgency to bring this soil into the production to meet the local food demand is leading to the adoption of intensive agriculture and unsustainable practices that's causing irreversible soil degradation, the loss of these resources in the medium and long run, seriously threatening food security in the future. As the world had begun to recover from COVID-19, another conflicts with far-reaching effects broke out, which also have the impact on food trade, food crisis, and also the fertilizer at the global scale. Soil is an essential natural resource for food production, well-functioning of ecosystems, and for human well-being. Over 95% of the food we eat is produced in soils on land. In addition, soils provide other essential ecosystem services, such as regulating climate change, water retention, hosted 1/4 of the global biodiversity, and also buffering and degrading the pollutants. In short, healthy soils contribute to the resilience of ecosystems to climate-related extreme events, such as drought or floods, and ensure the productivity of and the proper functioning of terrestrial ecosystems. However, 1/3 of soil on this globe is already in poor or very poor condition. Soils are under increasing pressure due to urbanization, competing for land use, rising food demand, climate change, land degradation, and pollution. Conventional unsustainable agriculture practice accelerates soil degradation process and exacerbate food insecurity and social inequality worldwide. On the global scale, an annual loss of 75 billion tons of soil from arable land is estimated to cost about $400 billion each year because of the loss in agricultural production. To prevent further soil degradation, FAO has identified key principles that every government must consider to conserve and to restore soil health. 2 normative reference documents for the technical guidance and the policy development on sustainable soil management summarize these principles. One is the revised World Soil Charter. The other is the voluntary guideline for sustainable soil management. Sustainable soil management provides farmers and land users with great benefit in the short, medium, and long term, improving productivity and nutrition, reducing the environmental impacts, and providing ecosystem benefits and improved livelihood. In the current fertilizer crisis, sustainable soil management and integrated soil fertilizer management stand out as the key solutions. However, soil degradation is either an isolated phenomenon or a local problem. It presents a global issue where all the stakeholders need to engage responsibly to ensure that the soil are managed sustainably and the goal of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development are met. The protection and sustainable management of soils is therefore of utmost importance to ensure food and nutrition and a healthy and safety environment, as well as intergenerational equity. In this perspective, ensuring healthy soils must be a core aspect that new agri-environmental policies and laws need to integrate it at global, regional, and local levels, global, regional, and national levels to ensure good soil governance. Just to give you a few numbers regarding the soil legislation. To date, not even 30 countries have a specific soil law or soil act. Only 17 countries have a systematic national regulation. That is even less than 10% of 194 members of the FAO. Then if you look at the strategies or plans, then the number changed significantly. To date, there are almost 400 strategies, national plans focused on soil that directly address the soils. So the vast majority of these is estimated to come from about eight countries. Of this, one of the recent one that's developed certainly has been just presented by the colleagues from EU. It's the EU strategy for 2030. Then at the national level, the most modern national plans have been adopted by countries, for example, Australia, and the United States, Ireland, Austria, Switzerland, Thailand, Moldova, England, China, and Italy. Unfortunately, not all of these countries have adopted legislation at the national level, which shows that even the most soil-conscious countries are not always able to produce, at least in the short term, legally binding act that's really aimed exclusively at the soil protection. In other words, while many countries have understood the importance of the proper soil management, very little have been done to translate this awareness into practical legislation measures. Ladies and gentlemen, with the world's population expected to grow by 2 billion in the next 30 years, which demanding much more nutritious and safe food, it is therefore that the soil governance is strongly addressed, that the mechanism and actions are strengthened at local, national, regional, and global levels. Soil governance requires development and implementation of coherent policies, promoting practices and methodologies that regulate the use of soil resources and avoid degradation and conflicts between the users. But it also requires a better understanding of the status of the soil, the drivers and the pressures that caused soil degradation, and put soil together with the management approaches through the land and water perspective that's addressing multiple benefits by improving the natural resource management. Also, soil monitoring must be a key part in that perspective. FAO and the Global Soil Partnership are joining force with a wide range of the stakeholders to strengthen the soil governance by providing legal guidance for the development and the strengthening of regulatory framework that affect soils, as well as strengthening and develop capacities to monitor the soils at the national level, as well as to support them to better plan for the future. So this event constitutes a very tangible output of the collaboration between FAO and the Institute of Law of the University of Natural Resources and Life Science and the German Environment Agency on Soil Governance. I hope it will materialize in the concrete outputs for further strengthening the global soil governance. Thank you very much for your attention. Back to you.
Yes, many thanks, Mr. Lee, for your input and for pointing out, finding a bit the interface of food security and sustainable soil management first. Second, need for international, national, and local governance. It's not only one level we need to take into account, but all these levels. Third point was that you really highlighted the need for effective laws on sustainable soil management and effective implementation. And last but not least, the issue, which was also addressed by Professor Messner on monitoring and the availability of soil data. So many thanks for this input. And now we would move on to the moderated discussion. And the first round of questions will be moderated by my colleague Oliver. So I pass over. Oliver, please.
Thank you, Harald, and thanks to the speakers. They have been spanning an arc on the issue of soil from various perspectives, from a governance perspective, from a security perspective, from multi-level soil governance, multi-crisis, multidisciplinary aspects of soil. And in that regard, I would like to come back to Professor Dirk Messner, who made some very pertinent remarks. And I would like to dig a little bit deeper. Mr. Messner, why is soil now suddenly on the political agenda? Why is soil now important? Why has it been neglected? And what are the core elements of soil governance that you would like to emphasize to our audience here today so that we can take up this advice for our work in future? Mr. Messner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me pick up some of the elements of questions which you have been emphasizing. No, I mean, the first point is that I would argue that we understand the urgency of the matter now much better than, let's say, 10 years ago or so. And Mr. Lee, our last speaker, emphasized this urgency. No? In the hunger dimension, we are again losing ground, Mr. Lee. This is what you said, no? And we are having 2 billion people additionally towards 2050 on the planet. So food security is very relevant. From the hunger and food perspective, the urgency is very clear now. On the other hand side, during the last 10 years, we have been understanding the interaction between biodiversity and soil, and biodiversity and soil and climate much better than we did beforehand. Remember that during the first decades of discussing the climate issue, the energy dimension has been emphasized very strongly, and we have been making progress also in this field. But the understanding that the climate challenge without ecosystem stability, without biodiversity stability, and even without negative emissions, so more carbon emissions, taking more carbon emissions into the ground, into soils, into the ecosystems, has been understood much better. This is a result of our research strategies of the last decade. So in this regard, I would argue that we have better data on the table now. We have better knowledge on the table now. We understand that soil, who said soil has been seen as dirty, as a dirty resource under our food. Andrea, you mentioned this. You talked about this. So now we see that that soil and land systems are part of the overall sustainability challenges from these different perspectives which we debated here in our discussion group and which have been emphasized by the speakers. When it comes to governance, I mean, I agree on what has been said from the different perspectives. Now, on the one hand side, the local, national, global aspect is very important. No? First, locally, soil has been and needs to be managed sustainably. If we don't do things right on the local level, we do not get the global systems right. On the other hand side, Mr. Lee rightly emphasized that soil is a globally connected ecosystem at the end of the day. No? So we need global perspectives, global standards, global efforts. So this multi-level perspective is something which I would emphasize strongly. And then from the different speakers, Andrea, you mentioned this, no? From the different speakers, we heard that identifying the co-benefits between different purposes using soil is very important. You took the example, Andrea, of the farm-to-fork strategy on the one hand side. No? So how to reorganize our food systems in order to get biodiversity stabilized and at the same time invest in food security in Europe and internationally. This is something which we try to organize in the farm-to-fork strategy, co-benefits. No? And there are other fields where co-benefits are also gaining importance. We at our agency did studies on the issue of using land, agricultural resources, and energy. No? If you look at this, the first impression is many tension fields. You can only use a soil resource once, not twice. No, but if you look at this more in a more specific and differentiated way, you can see that the combination between agriculture and photovoltaic, the combination between agriculture, what we call agri-photovoltaic, no? So using the land for agricultural purposes and combine it with photovoltaic is 30 to 40 times more energy efficient in terms of what we bring out of it as energy outputs than using the same agricultural source for energy-based, for biomass-based energy production. No? So we need to shift from our old modus of energy of biomass-based energy production to agri-photovoltaic. We need this kind of synergy perspective, co-benefits perspective, and therefore innovation perspective. And then my last thought is, and this has been said by many of the speakers also, it's about regulation and standards and law. And I agree with Mr. Li Feng Li that we have a lot of progress in the knowledge field, but we are still struggling in translating this into law and standards and regulation on these different levels, locally, nationally, globally, and between the sectors. This was what I took from Andrea, between the sectors. So these are some reflections, Oliver, from my side. Thank you.
Or two short questions, because you've mentioned the aspect of soil being local, being national, being regional, being global in its relevance. It is, on the one hand, linked to the land, but it's also detached from the land. And in that sense, when we address soil from a legal perspective, how can we now take the data and information and that is available and translate this into more effective legal measures? The law, as we have traditionally been trained, is linked to the sovereign territory of the state. And if you detach soil from that territory in terms of global interests, how do we anticipate the law to become more effective? I do understand that Germany is taking a lead in Europe in designing a new federal state law on soil protection, Bundesbodenschutzgesetz. But I also understand that Germany is a country consisting of different federal states. So how does this coincide? How does this then respond to the new European soil strategy and to global efforts under, for instance, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change? I don't expect you to give the answer, but these are some of the questions that we have been puzzled with over the past years, and we're still struggling to connect the dots.
I mean, Oliver, let me react very quickly to some elements. No, the first thing you talked about monitoring and data, and this is a very important point. In Germany, we are making now efforts to bring biodiversity data together into one system. On the one hand side, no. And on the other hand side, within our own agency, we are bringing all the environmental data under a common framework. And this sounds very technical, but it's very important for our discussion here, because we said that we need to understand these multi-purpose issues around soil and the different and conflicting uses of soil. If we don't bring our isolated databases together, we cannot monitor that, and we therefore cannot understand this, and then we cannot measure and govern it. And what we are doing in the German context, so bringing the biodiversity data fields together and overall the environmental data we are monitoring into one monitoring system, is connected with what is happening, Andrea, on the European level. The same thing's happening. We are building a database which is then better manageable and allows us to monitor also the interlinkages between these different usages. So this is very important. Therefore, I'm re-emphasizing this. And then, Oliver, regarding global governance and territorially oriented governance, my colleague Harald Ginsky will talk on the second panel more concretely about soil protection laws and soil protection instruments and standards and rules in the German context. He's the expert on that. Therefore, I will not move into this direction. But what I wanted to emphasize is that because I'm a global governance expert, I've been working on climate policy for decades and sustainability, global governance efforts for many, many years. I mean, on the one hand side, territorially based sustainability strategies are obviously needed, and we all emphasize this. But this needs to be complemented by global efforts in different regards. I mean, let's learn from climate protection. We know from climate protection, we know that without common global goals, we will not make progress. So defining common goals is very important. Defining global targets is very important. This needs to be related to global databases. And in addition to that, we also know that we need to support many developing countries to get their sustainability strategies and also their soil strategies as part of their sustainability strategies right. This is also something which goes beyond our activities on the level of the nation state. Unfortunately, and therefore I talked at the beginning of my intervention about the multiple crisis situation and the crisis of global cooperation. Unfortunately, what we can see is that Mr. Lee mentioned the urgency of the matter. So hunger again is on the rise, and degradation of soil is still increasing. But our international investments in sustainability cooperation around the globe is shrinking. And this is unfortunately also true for us as donors in this field from Europe. So our efforts in international cooperation around sustainability issues, and soil is an important part on that, it needs to be re-stabilized and needs to grow instead of shrinking it. Thank you.
Messner, thank you for putting all of this together for us. We see soil as an element of integration, as an element that can coincide global interests with local interests. And we understand that we need to utilize the data and the information more effectively to inform legislative processes. This brings me to the next point on the agenda. Integrating new legislative processes is something that we have been working on the African continent. And Robert Wabudoa from the United Nations Environment Program is joining us here due to the fact that Patricia Kameri-Mbote had some other obligations, but he is so well versed to come in and to enlighten us from an African perspective, where we have 54 countries on a continent that is so diverse, and where we have made investigations on the need to protect soil on the continent that is most affected by climate change in the interest of the global human survival. Robert, welcome here today in our conference. Could you please tell us a little bit about the African perspective, why we need to protect soils on the African continent? What are the social benefits from soil management in Africa? And what are the main obstacles that we are facing? Who are the front runners, and how can we utilize data more effectively in legislative processes? Robert Wabudoa, Karibu, Kenya, welcome.
Thank you, Prof. And greetings from Nairobi. Yeah, as you have said, I'm from United Nations Environment Program. I work as a regional coordinator on governance. But let me first start saying that in my previous life, I think I was among the few people in the world who drafted or prepared legislation on soils. This was somewhere in 2000 in my home country, Uganda. And here I am, I find myself dealing with, again, with the subject of soils governance. The issue of soils in Africa, I think the colleague from FAO, Lee, has given a very good picture of it in terms of the issues, the challenges, and so on. But from the African perspective, let me just only emphasize what Lee has said, is that Africa is recorded as one of the regions bearing the brunt of the $8 billion lost annually across the world owing to soil erosion. Estimates show that 75 to 80% of the continent's cultivated area are degraded, resulting in a loss of 30 to 60 kilograms of nutrients per hectare per year. However, given that up to 64% of Africa's population depends on agriculture for a living, the poor frequently depend on land and other natural resources for their immediate needs, including food and livelihoods. It is also estimated that 30 to 50% of all the food produced in Africa is lost. With these losses, up to 25% of fresh water and 20% of soil resources are wasted on producing food that is not consumed, and pressure to produce more food to make up for the losses puts more pressure on the soils, and therefore, of course, it becomes critical for the soils governance to happen. Now, as I said, the other points the colleague from FAO mentioned, they shouldn't waste a lot of time going that one. But to note, one of the biggest degraders of soil in Africa includes poverty, the issue of poverty, which leads to overexploitation. There is a high population growth across the region. They are also inappropriate practices, agricultural practices or other practices, such as overstocking, overgrazing, erosion, landslides, over-application of agricultural chemicals. And above all those, of course, the governance systems are inadequate. Again, I would say that FAO has gone through that. It didn't need to go into that. But when you look at the issues of soil governance in Africa, having practiced a little bit of it, is that the gaps which we see in the governance side is the one, awareness on the importance of soils, because people live on the soils, do agriculture and so on, so they don't take into consideration that sustainable soil governance or management is key, and therefore they tend to assume that the soil is going to be there forever and ever, and therefore that is a question of awareness. The second aspect of it is across the whole continent, the scientific data is low and information to show the trends so as to inform policy and the rest and so on. Of course, there's weaknesses in policies and legislation and the usual issues of technical and financial resources. We find those as some of the key things across the continent in whichever country you go to. Now, this year, together with the Prof. Oliver there, and also the German Environment Protection Agency, we initiated a move to bring the issues of soil governance to the highest political levels. Policy change is the biggest driver for development, and therefore the African Ministerial Conference on Environment, which is the main body dealing with environmental issues in Africa, on 15th and 16th of September in Dakar, came out with a decision, a policy decision, on enhancing soils governance, soils governance in Africa. I'll take you back a little bit. When you look at AMCEN, it's a ministerial body of all the 54 countries.
Robert is frozen. We will wait until he comes back. Yeah, so I think Robert will come back to us, but we should proceed in our discussion and come back to what Robert just mentioned on the issue of AMCEN and developments on the African continent. I think I have a short question to Dr. Zhu, but Harald will also take over the moderation from me. Dr. Zhu, this securitization of soil, is that an issue that is becoming more and more pertinent? Because in the context of climate change, we understand that the securitization of the climate has pros and cons, but you've mentioned the issue now in the wider context of the aggression in the Ukraine. What can you tell us about this particular strong word?
Thank you for that question. I think it's very interesting to look at a lot of the agendas that we are discussing today in terms of sustainability, environmental and soil management. We sort of assume that these are a part of a shared endeavor, which assumes also a positive sum definition of security. Positive sum being this is additive and that your security contributes to my security. Securitization, of course, in the academic literature has a particular meaning in terms of urgency and sometimes also even militarization and sort of the pouring of resources into a sector. And that can be positive, as you mentioned, for climate change and for some topics that we have tried to put much more in the forefront of policymakers' minds. But I think what I have felt very deeply over the past couple of years is not so much certainly securitization, but also securitization in the dimension of security being as sort of a zero-sum competition. And that's, of course, natural resource competition, but also geopolitics at sort of an international level. So when you look at things like food security, most of all of us here in this panel and also in the audience would assume that necessarily means something that is broad-based, that is global, that is universal, that applies to households and individuals. But I think the dimension of national security, I think you see these sectors also becoming a part of the security conversation of national governments in much more parochial ways. And that includes land and also soil, to the extent that also contributes to agricultural productivity and sort of national agendas on sort of export dominance or self-sufficiency as a result of kind of the geopolitical situation. All of these can have negative effects, both for environmental management and for soil management. So I definitely do think that's a concern, including in the Ukraine context, where you've seen also Russia increasingly utilize sort of its role as a major agricultural power and exporter indeed, and try to politicize it in ways that serve its purposes in much more narrow senses. So yes.
Dr. Seuss, thank you. We have in the past discussed the issue of water wars and geopolitics in water governance. Is that something that we will be able to translate in the wider context of soil? So soil wars and geopolitics of soil in the interest of food security and growing populations around the world?
There's been quite a lot of work done on sort of the nexus of food insecurity and conflict. Some of it points in different directions. There's certainly a linkage there. But I think what is most alarming to me is, what Dirk mentioned in terms of the breakdown of international cooperation and sort of the frameworks for getting important states to sort of come together and manage global, really transnational crises. That is breaking down. And that I think is of great concern to me, and I think should be to all of us. Not necessarily in terms of communal conflicts, which is an important thing to monitor, but in terms of how we manage international markets, in food markets, sort of making sure that food and agriculture as a sector does not become politicized, that the markets are kept open and functioning, also for the most vulnerable and for importing states. And those things I think we can't achieve until some sort of baseline normalcy is sort of brought back into play in terms of global governance and sort of the great powers.
I saw the hand from Dirk Messner before I give him the floor. I would actually like to put this under the lens of the Russian aggression in the Ukraine, because the lock-in of crops that has only recently been released in the interest of global food security, but also and especially in the interest of food security on the African continent, where we find populations most vulnerable and prone to poverty. How is this then going to develop further, and how can we increase global cooperation efforts in order to assure that the ones most vulnerable do not suffer the most from these types of aggressions and conflicts?
If that's towards me, perhaps Dirk has also a perspective on this, but I mean, certainly if you look at Russian aggression in Ukraine, there is, at some point, Russia had occupied a quarter of Ukrainian, almost a quarter of Ukrainian farmland. Meanwhile, they have a very aggressive domestic policies in terms of agricultural land expansion for the purposes of export dominance. And they've been willing to use food and agriculture as a sort of political trade weapon. They have done so, and they continue to do so. There is still the ongoing agricultural ban of European and Western food products in the Russian market. And all of these things are, they're not minor in terms of the global international commodity markets, in the wheat market in particular. But at the same time, you do, there's room certainly for markets to continue functioning, because these contracts are year to year. Certain buyers can, they can shift their supplies to other producers. But I think the overall framework of making sure that there is still a strong foundation for addressing these things multilaterally, controlling speculation and other kind of reasons why the markets are volatile beyond just Russian activity. I think that there's a lot of ways in which there could be better governance on these issues, making sure that some of the most vulnerable both countries and populations are not as affected as they are from the activities in Ukraine in particular. But that's a tough question, of course.
Giving your best try. Before I revert to Robert Babonoa from the African perspective, I would like to pass over the word to Dirk Messner.
Yeah, thank you, Oliver. I wanted to build quickly on what JG, I hope I pronounce your name correctly, JG, what you said on securitization of the issue, no? So soil scarcity and land issues. And Oliver, you asked, is this a similar debate as the debate we had already on water and crisis and water and security? And my reaction to that is twofold. On the one hand side, we see, and JG mentioned this, that that food and therefore soil is used as a weapon in military confrontations. This is the Russian war. No? Then we have similar, very direct links between political activities and crisis situations and conflict situation. Land grabbing has been mentioned already. No? So land grabbing can also have severe geopolitical impacts. This is the direct mechanism, or these are direct mechanisms between using soil and food as weapons in political confrontations. And then on the other hand side, there is another channel which can produce conflicts. I have been heading a research study already in 2007 or 8 or so. What we did there was we tried to imagine a 4 degrees warmer world, and we wanted to elaborate and reflect on how to adapt to that. No? And at the end of the day, the title of our study then was Climate Change as a Security Risk. Not in the sense that we expect wars around water or wars around soil. Also, this is also possible, as we can see now in the Ukraine, unfortunately. No? But what we demonstrated is that from the soil and water angle, Oliver, no? When you get together desertification trends, degradation of land, scarcity of water, and therefore scarcity of food, and collapse or at least reduction of food production in vulnerable countries, this can of course relate in making fragile and weak countries even more fragile and weak. On the other one hand side, and this can also translate easily, and we see this internationally, in migration flows. No? And both of these mechanisms have the potential to trigger conflicts in countries and insecurity in countries, human insecurity anyway, but also this has the potential of becoming regional or even international. And therefore, I see this kind of interlinkage between security risks on the one hand side and environmental degradation and environmental collapses on the other hand side. Thank you.
For the clarification, and before we looking at the watch shift to the other speakers, I would like to quickly go back to Robert Babonoa, talking about human vulnerability, human security, the securitization, land grabbing, all issues super relevant to the African continent. Robert, you were just mentioning the role of AMSEN and ambitious intentions on the African continent at UNEP. Can we please connect to what you were just saying before we were interrupted? Okay, Robert, while we still cannot hear you, I see you.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you now, Robert.
Yeah, yes, I can hear now. I think they had lost like 3 minutes of hearing. I think I had to refresh the button. Can you repeat the question?
Yes, we were just talking about human vulnerability, human security, the element of the ones most vulnerable suffering from, for instance, the conflict in the Ukraine and lack of food security. We were talking about land grabbing as an issue to soil governance. All of this is so pertinent to the African continent. And you were just mentioning some ambitious efforts ongoing from AMSEN at UNEP in Africa. And I would like to reconnect to what you were just saying.
The way I see it is from the point of view of conflicts or conflict resolution. Because if you have a population depending on land, a high population depending on land, the chances of having conflicts, localized conflicts mostly, is high. Especially when the soils become less nutritious, less productive, people tend to go into other areas of it. to the extent that, of course, that one creates conflicts, localized conflicts between people. Of course, the solutions are not, to me, found in legislation. It's in the wider governance aspects of assuring sustainability of the soils, proper soils management, and the whole bigger picture of sustainable land management. I think in Africa, the countries are seeing more from the point of view of sustainable land management. I would withhold myself from the issue of food supply from Ukraine to Africa and so on, simply because I think the statistics are not available or clear. It is just only a media issue, because most of Africa eats maize. I think our colleague from FAO can even testify to that. They eat maize, they don't take a lot of wheat. So the point of whether such a conflict can bring increased hunger or not to the African continent is a debatable issue, because the food which was coming from Ukraine is not Africa, is wheat and not maize. And maize is the main staple food sustaining nearly 90 or 80% of the continent. So I wouldn't go into the media talks and the rest and so on. But then again, if we go back to sustainable soil management or governance, is that the presence, I always still believe that the presence or absence of laws alone is not enough. It's more on the issue of awareness, provision of data, technical aspects, and so on, and people appreciating. It solves a lot of the sustainability of soils more than the presence or absence of legislation. Legislation, of course, is supportive and policy and the rest and so on. But if I was to do interventions, I would do more on the softer part of it to solve the issues of soils governance. Back to you. I hope I've picked the issues you had raised.
Thanks, Robert. Dear colleagues, dear panelists, we have now spoken a lot about the international level, but at the beginning we also said that we need to also address the local level and the national level. And I would like to focus a bit more with my question at the end of our session. Maybe we can go a bit longer, maybe 5 minutes. But my question is actually, we have heard today that sustainable soil management would have a lot of core benefits for many purposes. Data is potentially available. Soil degradation, if it is ongoing, has very negative effects. Nature, of course, but to society as well. So my question to Andrea and maybe the colleague from the FAO is why this has not happened so far? Why there is not a real sustainable soil management? And so what are the obstacles and what are the solutions? And if I address Andrea, I would like to mention that in 2006, there was already a draft soil directive, which was it was at least a starter. It was not a perfect instrument, but it was conceptual, but conceptually it was a good mechanism. So my question is, what are the obstacles and what are the solutions? Andrea, please.
Well, I think that the obstacles are precisely that we need to define a framework at European level that on one side works, of course, across the different member states, while a lot of decisions that affect soil are taken at local level. It's the municipality who decides to convert an agricultural field in a new supermarket car park, or decide to take a forest and transform it into a new urban settlement. and so that's clearly a difficulty. So we need to build, and that's the effort that we're putting now, lessons, learning also from the lessons of the discussions over 8 years in the previous proposal, really how to build a common framework, because of course, if we have to monitor something, if we need to report it, if you need to compare data, if we need to integrate better soil into other policies, we need to have common definitions, we need to have common monitoring, and some basic obligations across the EU. But also trying to integrate into that the subsidiarity and trying to give the flexibilities to the member state to translate this into provisions that work at national level, and then lower at regional, and then at local level. So this is clearly the challenge. The other challenge is the cross-cutting nature of soil. We talked about the international dimension. We should not forget that soil is the fil rouge, is the common link between the three Rio Convention, the UNCCD on desertification, the UNFCCC on climate change, and the Biodiversity Convention. Soil is the key pillar of the three of them. But soil is also an element of industrial policy, of pollution, of responsibility, financial responsibility. We have a European liability directive. We have soil is a key element of agricultural production, and it's a key element of climate change and biodiversity. We already discussed this. So the fact that it's so much cutting across different sectors is clearly challenging to find common rules, common understanding, and share the responsibility, because at the end, everybody is responsible for the protection of soil within its sectors. And another element is that compared to air, for instance, where you can clearly set rules, or when you have emissions into of pollutants, there is a strong psychological element of soil which relates to private property. So this is also a key element which we need to overcome. I think that most of the people own a house, and nevertheless, we have strict rules set by the public authorities on how, if we can build an additional floor, what type of roof, which color our house needs to have, and so on and so forth. There are strict rules on how the walls needs to be built, how the electricity system, how the water pipes. You know, the house is a private property, but nevertheless, there are a lot of rules, public rules and obligations that affect this. And we need to have a certain system in which, while the land is a private property, the ecosystem services of soil needs to have a recognition of a value for the future generations and for the public goods that these ecosystems provide. And we need clearly to combine these different aspects. These are clearly the challenges. We are aware of it, and we are working on it with the contributions of, as I said, of stakeholders, of scientists, and I really count also on the strong support from the Austrian German environment agencies, in addition to many regional, local, and national authorities on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. I think we will dig into this a bit deeper in the second session. My question would be whether we need something like a compensation regime, which means that for all ongoing soil degradation, they need to be compensated in another location, whether in order to at least achieve kind of neutrality with regard to soil degradation. That would be fundamental change of our regulatory concept, and it would be really could be an instrument to at least stop, from a neutrality perspective, ongoing soil degradation. It's one point. A second could be quantitative targets, like, for example, the obligation to avoid any new soil sealing, new soil sealing in certain municipalities. It would be also a very clear target and obligation in order to avoid the destruction of soil. But we need to discuss this further. The same question on the obstacles and the potential solutions. I would like to pass to a new colleague from the FAO, Miss Vienna Berger. I hope you have heard us. Could you please give an answer to this question from the perspective of FAO? What are the obstacles in the past and maybe in the future with regard to achieving sustainable soil management, and what could be the solutions which could be offered by FAO, hopefully? Thank you. Cannot hear you. You're muted. No?
Now?
Yes. Perfect. Please, Mr. Berger. Ms. Berger.
Sorry. And the question was the obstacles?
The obstacles to sustainable soil management and potential solutions from the perspective of FAO.
Yes. Yes, a healthy land and soil play an important role in achieving more than half of the SDGs, especially in food security, food safety, and human health, and water quality and land management, as well as for SDGs 1, 11, 12, 13, 14, which relate to reducing poverty, urban development, responsible production, climate change, and overall biodiversity, as already said, preservation.
I think we can come back to that response after our break. This brings the first session to an end, and we cordially would like to thank all the panelists for their insights, for setting the scene for our next panels, and pointing out so many stringent issues from different perspectives, especially the fact that soils protection cannot be disintegrated from a holistic sectoral perspective. Soils protection cannot be conducted on one level only. The element of law cannot be overestimated, but it needs to be informed by solid databases. Data per se is not information. Information needs to be translated into regulatory relevance, and perhaps we need to better understand how to digitalize the law in order to make it more effective to protect what is most needed in the interest of global food security and ongoing multiple crises. I would like to close this session now and would like us to all give a virtual round of applause to the panelists, thanking them once again, and we will adjourn in the same forum, utilizing the same link at 1 p.m. Central European Time. Thank you once again, and greetings from Graz.